Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
You know what's smart? Enjoying a fresh gourmet meal at home that you didn't have to cook. Meet Factor, your loophole in the laws of mealtime. Chef-crafted meals delivered with a tap, ready in just 2 minutes. You know what's even smarter? Treating yourself without cheating your goals. Factor is dietitian approved, chef prepared, and you plated. Pretty smart, huh? Refresh your routine and eat smart with Factor. Learn more at factormeals.com.
And welcome, everybody, to another amazing day right here on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. On today's show, I made a I don't want to say pretty, but a controversial post on Facebook and X outlining how we are letting, the point of the post was to let people know that we're letting those who should be held accountable, those who should know better, off the hook when it comes to our recent excitement that people have had about reducing waste, fraud, and abuse. It's a good thing to do. We need to be doing that, but we need to make sure we hold the correct people accountable for, well, frankly, misspending our dollars. And on that topic, I'll talk about a specific piece of legislation that goes a long way to stopping waste of millions of dollars that happens here in Kentucky every year. I'll detail what that is. Then finally, Louisville Public Schools, Jefferson County Public Schools, had another instance of an elementary school where a kid brought THC gummies to school. We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. But before I dig down into it, please make sure you like, comment, share, and subscribe. If you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, make sure you leave a review. You can always reach out to the show. You can email info@theandrewshow.com or head over to theandrewshow.com and fill out the contact tab. But without further ado, let's dig down into it. So I made this post on social media that was a little more controversial than I expected. So I'll kind of lay it out for you and talk about why it was, people felt that I was somehow a traitor. I wasn't a real conservative. In fact, one said, this is what the post said. I said, I've recently seen many comments from people asking for Kentucky to have its own Doge. While I 100% agree with identifying waste and cutting it from the budget, Kentucky doesn't need Doge. Honestly, the federal government didn't actually need Doge either. What Doge is accomplishing nationally is only because there is someone willing to do something about it do something about what it discovers that has power, right? While creating a Doge for Kentucky might create a more streamlined source for citizens to become aware of waste, the question is, what will Kentucky do about it? The power to make cuts, the power to investigate expenditures, the power to control the purse strings already exists within the hands of Republicans in the state. Kentucky already has a government contract review committee that is run by Republicans. Every single service and personnel contract goes through the committee, and legislators can ask questions about those contracts. Kentucky already has a Republican auditor that is supposed to hunt down fraud and abuse. Kentucky already has a Republican state treasurer that is cutting the checks for every single expense and has to match those expenditures up with the Republican-approved budget. While I understand the difficulties that exist due to having a Democrat governor, it doesn't mean there's nothing more that Republicans can do. If Republican leadership in the Kentucky legislature stopped spending more and more every year, they could do something about the waste. They could simply start reducing every department's budget by the amount of waste that is identified. The departments would start to self-regulate in order to avoid cuts. However, that would take work, and that is the real reason why Congress, both in KY and nationally, has never done anything about the ridiculous waste of funds that goes on. It would take too much work for those in power. Now, when you hear that in its entirety, you may not think that should be all that controversial. In fact, Rand Paul recently made kind of a similar statement that said, the cuts that Trump is making have to be ran through Congress. And the point behind talking about those cuts having to be run through Congress, please propose a bill so we can get those cuts done, is specifically because when we can pass a law that stops the spending, it becomes more permanent. Because what's going on right now in the federal government is that you have an individual who has volunteered his time, who has a platform specifically that people follow, and has the ear of the president, that is, and has the tools available to him to help identify waste, fraud, and abuse. But he's not the first person to ever find the waste that we're talking about here, spending $50 million on condoms over to Africa. In fact, for the last decade, Rand Paul has put out a Festivus report every year that talks about the billions upon billions of dollars that the federal government wastes and spends money on. He publishes that report to the public. He's a sitting senator, and yet nothing's been done about it. In fact, longtime listeners of the show know that I spend a significant amount of my time digging through and finding waste, fraud, and abuse. I dig through government contracts. I dig through things that are available to the public record, and I find all the time examples of millions of dollars of waste. We'll give you another example of one of those later on in the show. The point, though, about creating a Doge in Kentucky that kind of concerns me is that we as citizens are letting those who need to be held accountable off the hook. Because I know exactly what our Republican state legislature would do. They would gladly create a Doge, Department of Government Efficiency, and they already basically have with the Government Contract Review Committee. That's a statutory committee, meets every month, goes through all the contracts. They're literally tasked with finding waste and finding if contracts are fraudulent and shouldn't be spent. That is their stated mission. So they'll be glad to duplicate those efforts and put people on Doge, citizens and legislators alike. But the question comes down to, what are you going to do about it? Right now, the Government Contract Review Committee can vote to disallow contracts. Now, Beshear's able to override that veto. They've tried a few times to kind of address this. The state Supreme Court has stepped in. But one obvious thing they could do as a legislature, and I actually recently brought this up to a member of the Government Contract Review Committee, is why don't you every year, if the Supreme Court has said you're not allowed to just pass a law that says these contracts are hereby ended because we voted them down in the Statutory Review Committee, and so we have to cut those contracts. You ignored us. The governor vetoed it. We're passing this law. The governor can veto this law, and then we'll overvote it. It becomes law. These contracts are done for. If they're not willing to do that, well, then just come through and pass a reduction in budget bill every year and say, look, the committee, the Government Contract Review Committee, or the Republican auditor, or the Republican state treasurer have found these wastes, this fraud, this abuse within the governor's government, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to pass a law to stop them from doing it. We're going to not pass a law to stop them from doing it. We're going to pass a budget cut to the amount that they're wasting in spending. But instead, what the legislators will do is they'll create Doge. It's a place to create headlines, and then they'll use those headlines to attack Beshear. But their incentive structure is to actually do nothing about it. I've experienced this firsthand. Those of you who know my story well will remember that back in 2021, I filed paperwork to impeach the governor of Kentucky. Citizens are able to file that paperwork. An impeachment committee formed to investigate the claims we made. And one of our central claims was that Beshear knowingly violated the Constitution when he attempted to forbid people from going to church and then use KSP to harass them. Knowingly did it. In fact, we have an email from the then head of KSP, Rodney Brewer, saying that this was a clear First Amendment violation, what they were doing. And so the entire custom saying, look, you can't say this is a clear constitutional violation. I'm going to go ahead and do this anyways and get away with it. That's what we were trying to do. However, the Republican Impeachment Committee decided to go ahead and keep Beshear in place, and they decided not to impeach him. Now, the reason publicly they gave was that because, Beshear didn't knowingly violate the Constitution, which for many of you, as I'm saying exactly what he did, you would, even people with a basic understanding of our Constitution would say that clearly trying to forbid people from going to church is a First Amendment violation. But the real reason, they just need to create a reason to keep him in office. The real reason they didn't want to impeach him is because if they impeached him, Jacqueline Coleman would take over. And at the time, Beshear's approval ratings were pulling downwards. And they believed that come the next governor's election, that Beshear's negativity and how he's handled COVID will be a big problem for him, and they will be able to beat him in that election easier than they'd be able to beat somebody like Jacqueline Coleman when it came to the election. Of course, that didn't pan out. They were incorrect to believe that. But in the same way that they want the next election to be better for Republicans in the governor's race, so if they can create something that creates bad headlines for the governor that the public is paying attention to, they'll gladly do it. But what they will not gladly do is anything about it. In fact, they want Bashir to keep doing it. They want him to keep wasting your money, those in leadership, because they want to create those bad headlines because they want to win the next election. And then as soon as they do, I promise you this, that Kentucky Doge that the Republican legislature has created would go ahead and cease to really make a whole lot of noise at all, and the waste and fraud would continue because we haven't empowered our congressional leaders to look for these things and then do something about it. So I 100% agree with cutting the waste, but in the same way, when I say really the federal government didn't need Doge either, it already had departments that were supposed to be looking for waste, fraud, and abuse. We already had Republican-controlled oversight committees in Congress that are tasked with doing that job, but they weren't doing it. Or they'd find something and then Congress would fail to act on it. And so the concern that I have, that I think Rand Paul also has, is that by allowing citizens to claim they need an Elon Musk to come in, or they need a private group, this other group to come in and call it out, and until that happens, we can't do anything about it. Or here in Kentucky, creating it and then saying, well, we can't do anything about it because we have a Democrat governor, will create and continue to create excuses for the legislators that are responsible for allowing this continue. They're not fulfilling their role. So that is the entire point that I was making. Now, the comments back would be things like, why not start it now to show people the corruption? That was a response we got. But there's already, like I said, there's already people like myself doing it, but there's also already legislative committees, treasurers, auditors that are supposed to be doing it. Now, one of the things that people noticed and said the reason for Doge is, this was another comment from a Kobe Cobb, UK, said the reason for Doge is precisely because those in government lack the will to do what should be done and an outside source is required. However, they're once again failing the simple fact. Elon Musk isn't making the cuts. Donald Trump is. It's Donald Trump empowering those and handing his power down with his power that comes with the presidency that is then taking action on what Doge finds. Saying, well, we can't have somebody with government bringing it up. Well, it is because Donald Trump cares about this. And it is because Elon Musk cares about it and has a platform to create the information dissemination. So if Donald Trump doesn't act on it, that's a political problem that is creating the changes. You have got to elect the person to get the job done because they're the ones with the power, or people. Granted, the governor, like I said, can make cuts, but that doesn't create long term. In fact, here in Kentucky, the state Supreme Court has ruled it is actually unconstitutional for the governor to not spend money on something that the legislature has budgeted money to be spent on. We had this issue with Bevin, where Bevin didn't want to spend some money that was appropriated by the legislature on something for him to spend money on. He said, no, I don't want to spend money on that. I'm not going to spend it. And then what ended up happening was he was taken to court with the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court and the state ruled that he had to spend the money. You have to understand how our government is set up to understand that a group on the outside calling it out can create some headlines maybe, but who are you going to hold accountable? You're not doing it. They're not doing it. They aren't doing it now. So you need to make sure you elect the right people. That's the entire conversation. Vote better. That's the point. Now, some people took issue with my point. Obviously, they didn't read the full thing. For an example, Jusk Omo 95 said, You're so full of shit. If the fake conservatives like you were actually trying to make changes, changes would have already happened. That's like a comment said back to me, which is such a crazy comment to say to somebody like myself. One, I've ran for office. I do the show here. I've done it now for 5 years, about 4.5 years I've done this show. I don't get paid anything to do. I make like $100 a month off ad revenues on this show. This is clearly a project of labor. I'm going to talk about another story here in a second. Nobody's talking about it. Nobody's done the research on it this year. I did it this year. It took me an hour and a half this morning to do it. I'm doing it because I care and I want to bring this information to people. But also, when somebody says that, like, I'm just a common citizen. So my question would be, okay, well, changes haven't been made. So are you, Juscamo 95, trying to make changes? Changes haven't already happened. So that must mean you are yourself a fake conservative. But of course, that's a kind of conversation people, it's hard, right? And I see this on Twitter all the time. People listen to the shows. They can disagree with people in podcasts, still listen to them and respect opinions. I don't think you should agree with me 100% of the time on everything. If so, the question is, am I challenging thought processes enough, right? But on Twitter, a lot of times you have this feedback loop where people only want to see opinions that even in the first few sentences only accurately 100% mirror their own current beliefs. They don't want to read down and see that it's got nothing to do with a dislike for what Doge is doing. It's got to do with the fact that we have to hold the right people accountable. And failure to do so will just keep we'll just keep having the same problems we've had now for years. I mean, the same people who will applaud what Doge is doing, and recently we've seen some stories about Andy Barr, of course, positioning himself to run in that Senate primary. But the same people who applaud what Doge is doing will turn around and vote for Andy Barr for Senate in the Senate primary. I'll dig into that story more next week, talk more about the Senate race there on Monday next week. But my point I want to make here is the same people that see what Doge is doing, see this waste, fraud, abuse, and say this is wrong. A lot of them, not all of them, but a good percentage will then turn around and in this next Senate primary where we're trying to get a new senator to replace McConnell, or McConnell's stepping down and it's an open primary, so people are running, they'll turn around and vote for somebody like Andy Barr, who has never met a spending bill he doesn't like. That's the problem. I want to see real long-lasting change. So to just shout, Kentucky needs Elon, Kentucky needs Doge, once again, it's not Elon or Doge making the cuts, it's Trump. We need Congress federally to make them permanent, and in Kentucky, we don't have a governor willing to make the cuts. It's already been ruled by our state Supreme Court that even if we did, they would still have to spend the money. So we don't want to give it out to our Republican leadership in the legislature. It's not all Republican representatives. I know there's many, many, many who care about this issue. They're just not in the majority yet, that recognize what the body as a whole in Frankfurt is doing to fail on this issue. But unless we change what the legislature is doing, cuts in our government, the waste will continue. And speaking of waste that continues, that our Republican leadership has no desire to do anything about, let's talk about taxpayer-funded lobbying, okay? So government entities here in Kentucky directly spent $843,473 in 2024 alone lobbying the government of Kentucky. These are groups like the city of Ashland spent $20,000, Bullitt County $36,000, city of Covington $7,500, city of Frankfort $33,600, city of Georgetown $9,900, city of Madisonville $6,500, city of Pikeville, Kentucky $40,500, Davies County Fiscal Court $38,650, Fayette County Public Schools $16,263, Fleming County Public Schools $20,000, Franklin County Fiscal Court $25,000. Jefferson County Public Schools, $89,213. Greater Lexington Convention Visitors Bureau, directly funded through taxes, $48,401. Louisville and Jefferson County Metro Government, $66,000. Louisville and Jefferson County Metropolitan Sewer, $72,850. For the Jefferson County Sewer Department, $72,000. On top of what the universities are spending directly. That's a total. That's just to give you an example of some of them. That's not even all of them. If you add all that up, that's just what they spent in 2024. It adds up to $843,000. Now, for the last 3 years, Representative Felicia Rayborn, Representative Rayborn, has introduced legislation to prohibit taxpayer-funded lobbying in Kentucky. And you know what, real quick, that's not even the entirety of it. That's just what literally taxpayer-funded entities directly are spending. Indirectly, you have a whole nother problem because you have these associations and groups that are funded by tax dollars only, but end up having getting funds in from, your tax funds, but they themselves are not government, and then they turn around and lobby. To give you an example, you have the Kentucky Associations of Chiefs of Police. They spent $32,755 lobbying the state government. Now, the way those associations can pay for that is they take in membership fees. Those membership fees are not paid by the chiefs, coming out of the chiefs of police pockets. They're paid for by taxpayer dollars. The Kentucky Association of Circuit Court Clerks spent $14,767. The Kentucky Association of Convention Visitor Bureaus, those are taxpayer-funded entities, $9,363. Heck, the Kentucky Association of Counties, that's county governments pay into this, your tax dollars, spent $152,986 lobbying the state government. You have a lot of other groups too. You have Kentucky Associations of Property Value Administrators, Kentucky Association of School Administrators, they spent $38,000. Kentucky Association of School Superintendents, $24,000. Kentucky Association of you name it, judges, you name it, they got it. And so we also pay in money. Taxpayer funds are going to those groups that then turn around and lobby the state government. So when you actually look at how much of taxpayer funds are coming from solely, essentially their only source of money comes from taxes, whether that's through pass-throughs by, government officers paying fees to join it or whatever it may be, you start getting into millions of dollars a year of taxpayer funds spent lobbying the state government. Now, I thought, you can call me crazy, but I thought that the representatives we elect are supposed to be representing their areas, whether that's their mayors, their chiefs of police, their circuit court clerks, their schools, their cities, the counties within their district. They're elected to represent them. You would think they would be the best representative to the state legislature. They can vote, they can propose bills, they can propose amendments. But no, that's not how the system's working. Apparently, they're not very good. We're literally more than we pay in legislators' salaries, and taxpayer funds is being spent on private lobbyists to get the ear of the people who are elected to represent these people. Now, as I said, the last 3 years, Representative Rayborn has introduced this legislation to ban this. This year, the bill number is House Bill 254. You need to contact your state representative and demand they support House Bill 254. But that is my overall point that I started off with. We literally have legislators right now proposing bills to actually pass laws to stop the spending of millions of taxpayer funds that get wasted every year on lobbyists, trying to get that done. And of course, too, it's a cycle because they take those taxpayers' funds and then spend it to get more taxpayer funds back to their entity. So in turn, they can then have more taxpayer funds to pay lobbyists so they can then get more taxpayer funds, and the cycle continues and continues and continues. But that's on the table right now. And while I understand, You're like, look, we need a Doge. That I understand that thought process of we need that before we can do anything. I understand where that's coming from because you're seeing what they're doing nationally, and you want that here in Kentucky. I want it too. But by sitting there and waiting on this silver bullet, golden bullet solution, this savior to come to Kentucky, instead of doing that, we need to get off our butts and push for real legislation that could literally save the taxpayers millions to pass. That was my point in my original post. That's my point here. Hopefully you all can agree with me. You may still disagree and say, yeah, we need a Doge, but I would ask you, why would anybody pay attention to it if they're not paying attention to all the people who are calling out waste and fraud right now? I mean, you can follow Savannah Maddox online. She talks all the time about legislation and waste and fraudulent activities and corruption. You can follow, and of course, me on Twitter. You can follow Rising Voices. You can follow a handle, a girl that goes by Smokahannes out of Eastern Kentucky that posts a lot about corruption and waste in the areas. You can demand that your state treasurer and auditors and your government contract review committee start publicly pushing out there. Well, publicly their contracts are already available, but start actually talking about the kinds of contracts that they don't want to see anymore, and not leaving it for, people like myself to find out and have to read through the contracts every month to figure out what we want to talk about. What are the issues? Instead, they could talk about the issues they're finding, but we're not demanding that. Instead, we're almost demanding inaction. We should be demanding actual cuts now. House Bill 254 is a good place to start. Ending on a funnier note today, we have Jefferson County Schools. We had an elementary school where a student mistakenly, I'm going to guess mistakenly because, of course, I would hope that an elementary school student doesn't bring THC gummies to school on purpose, though I don't know anymore, because this is not the first time this has now happened. This is actually the second time, I believe, in 2 years that Jefferson County Schools specifically has had a elementary school too. This isn't high school, middle school, has had an elementary school kid bring THC gummies to class. When I went to elementary school, we had DARE officers come in, drug and alcohol resistance education. They'd come in and tell us the bad things about drugs. Apparently now in elementary school, you go to school to get the drugs given to you in a communal fashion in the form of gummies from fellow classmates. I mean, you don't need to go out on the streets and buy marijuana, apparently, as an elementary school kid. You just need to attend class, and they'll give it to you. And at a certain point, you have to ask, if this has happened twice now that we know about, how many times has this happened that nobody knew about? You send your kid to elementary school, and then they come home with high because on accident. It's just gross incompetence, surely. I just want to bring that up just because it's the second time this has happened, and I just find it absolutely ridiculous. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. Please come back on Monday. Hopefully, like I said, if you didn't agree with anything I just said, well, hopefully at least you still learned something from the information that I cover. So I hope to see you back here Monday. Big show Monday. Till then, we'll be seeing you.